Leuk dat je weer luistert naar een nieuwe aflevering van de Kinderopvang Podcast. Spelen is een serieuze zaak en essentieel voor de ontwikkeling van het jonge kind. Maar waarom is het zo belangrijk? En geven we onze kinderen wel genoeg speelruimte? In deze speciale reeks gaan directeur Emmeline Bijlsma en voorzitter Bas van het Woud elke aflevering in gesprek met een expert, onderzoeker of wetenschapper over het belang van spelen.
Ja, beste mensen, van harte welkom bij weer een nieuwe podcast van BK. Een podcast waarin ik, Bas van het Woud en Emmeline Bijlsma interessante gasten spreken die veel verstand hebben van de ontwikkeling van kinderen. En vandaag wederom een internationale gast waar we heel erg trots op zijn dat hij hier is. Bij ons de gast is Dan Wuori, een Amerikaanse schrijver, voormalig kleuterleraar en expert op het gebied van de ontwikkeling van het jonge kind. Misschien kent u hem van zijn LinkedIn-pagina waarin hij ons regelmatig verblijdt met prachtige filmpjes over de ontwikkeling van kinderen. Onlangs schreef hij het boek The Daycare Myth, What We Can Get Wrong About Early Care and Education and What We Should Do About It. We zien het boek op de achtergrond staan, dus we hopen op een mooie podcastaflevering. Dan, welcome. We're very honored to have you here.
Oh, Buzz, thank you so much for the invitation.
It's great to have you here. I was saying in Dutch as an introduction that a lot of people might know you from your LinkedIn page, where you post very nice movies or shorts, how should we call it, about the development of little children. And we see behind you your new book, The Daycare Myth. Can you tell us a little bit more about the central message of your book?
Absolutely. I'm happy to. And again, thank you for the invitation. So the book is really about what I view as a disconnect between what we know from the science of early development and the needs of young children and how those needs are met, or in many cases, here in the United States, not well met in our public policy. And so it is an opportunity, I hope, for parents and policymakers, certainly not just here in the U.S., but across the globe. I've been interested to find how many of the themes in the book really are very universal. Unfortunately, though, I will say, and the Netherlands is leading the U.S. in many parts of child and family policy, but there are some very common themes that I think are universal. One of those themes is that, at least here in the United States, we have for about 100 years really thought of our investment in what we call daycare or childcare as being sort of more a service to support the employment of parents than a service to optimize the development of young children. And the result, at least here in the U.S., is that we are getting things wrong during the early years, and instead of getting things right, we are choosing to pay for the results sort of endlessly of our errors in the early years. We are paying for more additional services in our education system. We're paying more for, more dependence on social services as adults. We're paying for worse health outcomes in adulthood. We're paying for, interactions with our criminal justice system and incarceration in ways that, I think, the best evidence available to us suggests that really high quality, proactive investments in young children could help us to mitigate. And so the book is sort of a call for re-examining our policy toward young children, not only to their benefit, but really to the benefit of society and to taxpayers writ large.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about where your passion for the development of young children comes from, because you have quite an interesting resume on this part. But where did it start? This passion for the subject?
Well, I would say that my passion for the subject, though maybe I wasn't fully aware of it at the time. Maybe it began in my own childhood. My father is a now retired developmental pediatrician.
Mhm.
And my mother worked throughout her career as a pediatric nurse. And so, I grew up in a household where uh, development was an important topic, and certainly service to children and families was a major topic. And I don't want to overstate. It's not like throughout my childhood we were talking about developmental psychology at the dinner table. Um, but as I entered young adulthood, I definitely had people say to me, "Oh, are you Dr. Wuori's son?"
Mm.
Um, and it was very, very impactful for me. They shared stories of how he, as a pediatrician in particular, working with children with, some very significant developmental disabilities in many cases, had made such an impact on their families and their lives. And it was at a time that I actually had begun a career in journalism. I worked in radio for a number of years and was really beginning to question around that time whether the career choice that I had made was going to be as impactful in the world as the choices that my parents had made. And it was, I've told this story many times, but it was around that time that a close family friend who ran a childcare program reached out to me one day in a panic, and I guess had a staff member resign abruptly, and was really in a bind and needed some help, and asked, she knew I was free in the late afternoons in this case, and so asked if I might, just for a couple of days, be able to come and fill in. And, I say it took about 15 seconds after walking into this classroom full of primarily 5 and 6 year olds, that I realized that I had made a terrible mistake in my career path, and was really meant to work with children. So that set me off. I became a kindergarten teacher, a school district administrator over there, early childhood programs, ran the state of South Carolina's, or helped to run the state of South Carolina's early childhood education agency for almost 15 years. And then, more recently have dedicated the past 6 or so years primarily to working with elected leaders across the country, the governors and the state legislators across the country, initially at a place called the Hunt Institute, which is located in Cary, North Carolina, and then here over the past year, sort of as a consultant in private practice, which has freed up some of my time to speak and to write and to focus on the social media work that you described. Just for the benefit of your listeners, your viewers as well. I think we connected on LinkedIn, but that content that you are describing, the child development content, is something that I post daily on, not only on LinkedIn, but on X, on Threads, and on Facebook. So
Yeah, great.
take your pick.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioned, because a lot of our listeners are on Facebook and not that much on LinkedIn. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
What did you, because in the Netherlands, the childcare policy also started as a service for working parents. Actually, it's still the most dominant part of it, but we do realize that it's very important for the development of children. What should change in the US childcare policy? Well, not in the policy, but in the way childcare is given, like what's really happening on day-to-day basis in childcare, or in daycare, as you call it, as it is called.
I'd be fascinated to hear how this is playing out in the Netherlands at this point. But right now, our American childcare industry is absolutely in crisis. It is more expensive than than parents can afford. It costs more to send an infant to one of these facilities in most states than it does to pay for college tuition. It costs more than, for many families, than housing. It is not a profitable business for those who go into it. We routinely see estimates of, profits of at or near 1%. So it's definitely not a get rich quick scheme for business owners. And then the whole thing is sort of balanced on the low wages that are paid to the teachers, who are almost exclusively women, and majority in many cases women of color. And so that is sort of the a part of the crisis that right now in the United States, we're really struggling with access, right? That many of these businesses are simply closing their doors at this point. We're struggling with affordability, but the book makes the case that the real crisis that the field is facing is a crisis of understanding, right? That we are fundamentally misunderstanding what these programs exist to provide, and that we have thought for a very long time that that what young children require is simply care, and that older children get involved in learning and education. And I always want to be very careful to distinguish too between the way I'm using care in this context and nurturing, for example, which is something that absolutely is needed. But in this context, I think many policymakers think of care or daycare or childcare as really being almost like a holding facility, right? That it's a place where your child is kept safe and warm and fed while mom and dad go off to work. But they are careful to distinguish between, oh, well, this is childcare and this is education on the other hand. And the book makes the case that we have decades of science that help us to understand that that's simply not the case. This idea that there is this thing called daycare. In fact, that's the daycare myth in the title. That this idea that there is this thing called daycare or childcare that is separate and distinct from education. And what we know is that that young children are learning not only from day one, but increasingly we have this emerging body of evidence that suggests that important forms of language learning, for example, are already having their roots sort of laid in utero. And so I'm hopeful that the book will prompt a conversation, sort of an if-then statement, right? That if we know this about how important these early years are, then what does that mean for our public policy? What does it mean in terms of how we make these services available, how we support families of young children, how we compensate and credential the workforce, all of these conversations that right now are sort of premised more on this custodial care model, as opposed to this is the most important window in all of human development.
And then because in the Netherlands we have sort of the same discussion, although I think we recognize that it's very important for the development of the youngest children. But then we get a discussion about how to do this, because there's also a lot of people who think, okay, if young children are already learning or educated, then it means formal education. So it means that we put the 2 years old kids on chairs, and then we show them words, and we hope that they already learned the words.
Yes. I'm so glad you raised that question, because I think it's in the same way that I want to distinguish between sort of the way I use care in the title of the book, and nurturing one-on-one interactions, which are very much needed. This question of education and learning is an important one to untangle a little bit as well. And here I've spoken to a number of people who make that exact case, that this question of, well, if we say that these are learning environments, then that does that mean that it becomes more like school formally? And no question, there's a danger of that. We've seen that over a period of years. I'm sure you've seen it in the Netherlands, where gradually what used to be taught to older children is being pushed downward.
Yeah, exactly.
But the case that I'm hoping to make here is that in the same way that we can distinguish between the appropriate methods of teaching and learning for a 6-year-old and someone in graduate school and at the university, and still consider it under the the broad umbrella of education. I believe that we can do the same thing even with infants and toddlers. But to be very clear, what the book is absolutely not advocating for is an extension of our public school system down to infancy, and definitely not advocating for, inappropriately didactic teaching methods. In fact, anyone who has followed me on social media, and it definitely is addressed in the book. I mean, we need those nurturing face-to-face one-on-one interactions that we've talked about. And as children age, we need ample opportunity for play. So this is to recognize the early years as important years for learning, is not to advocate for inappropriately academic methods of arranging these programs.
Okay, thank you.
In your book, you make a distinction between an advice for policymakers, teachers, daycare professionals, parents. A lot of our listeners and viewers will be daycare professionals. Mm-hmm. So what would be your most important advice to them?
Well, that's a great question, and you're right. The book is short, deliberately so. I mean, it is a concise sort of set. My hope had been that it would be something. My sense is that over time, people are reading maybe a little less and less. And so, the hope was not that this would be a 500-page book that people would, read a chapter or two of and then have sitting on a table, for the next 6 years. Instead, that this might really be something that, that readers would look at from cover to cover. But within that sort of, brevity of the book itself, the hope was that it would target 3 main audiences, right? That it would speak directly to parents and to policymakers and to professionals in the early childhood field. And the way that is accomplished is that the end of each of the 4 initial main chapters of the book, there is a section that I call the bipartisan blueprint for change, and in that section, I speak directly to each of those audiences. So it's here now, as we summarize this chapter, if you're reading this as a parent, what does this mean for you? Or if you're a policymaker, how what might you do about this? And so one of the messages to our early childhood professionals who are reading the book, one of the very important messages is that we as a field need to do a better job of sort of claiming our titles, right? That we can't expect for policymakers and for parents and the public to understand how important this work is until we help to communicate that. And part of that is, and again, with the caveat around the academic methods, part of the conversation that I'm hoping that the book will raise is an opportunity maybe to end our use of the terms daycare or childcare. We've come a long way in the United States. We very seldom call programs daycare at this point. It has shifted more into being childcare. But, I think both of those maybe misrepresent, again, the real power of these settings. And so, to acknowledge that these are, this is not a holding facility for young children. This is a school, right? It's a school that looks, very appropriate for infants and toddlers, for example, but it is a school nonetheless. That the people that work in these facilities are not daycare workers, they're teachers, right? And so that part of the change that certainly needs to be made here in the U.S. is really claiming those titles, helping to communicate, inviting policymakers into these programs to help
Mm-hmm.
them understand the important, forms of learning that are happening. Here, for example, in the United States, Emily, we're spending a lot of money and a lot of time and effort preparing uh, third graders, so 8-year-olds, to be able to read, right? That's sort of thought of as the cutoff here, in terms of, that up to a certain point that you are learning to read, and after that point you are using, you're reading to learn. And so
Mm-hmm.
states all across the US have passed these what we call third grade reading proficiency laws. And the upshot of that is that, if children are not reading proficiently by age 8, typically, they may be held back in that grade level before advancing in their education careers. And so, the states are spending, an endless amount of money, it seems, on reading interventions, but reading interventions primarily aimed at children when they are, 6 to 8 years old. And not recognizing that, at age 8, when they're formally assessed in terms of their reading proficiency, for many American children at least, they have spent 60% of their entire lives um, prior to ever setting foot in a public school program as 5-year-olds. And so,
Mhm.
recognizing that, that literacy proficiency, for example, begins with rich language development in infancy, and the development of wonderful and diverse vocabulary, and developing initially concepts of print and understanding how books work, and having that initial exposure to printed language. So much of what we are trying to almost sort of ameliorate, with older children, um, is something that we, in the same way that we're paying long term for the consequences, as I already mentioned, we're doing
Mhm.
the same thing in education. That we're waiting until children get close to that standardized testing age at age 8. Um, and it's almost like an emergency room at a hospital, right? That we're
Mm-hmm.
you know
Mm-hmm.
we're um, taking this very intensive approach just before testing, rather than thinking proactively about how that skill develops, beginning in utero, and moving all through infancy and toddlerhood.
We recognize it, and it's very interesting indeed. And the parents, what's your advice to the parents? Because you make me curious about that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, so there's a lot of advice for parents in the book, and in particular advice around um, choosing the setting for their infants. And the book, um, you know, really does not make the case for any one model. I think, the book begins with some discussion of what we know from the science of early development around what children need, right? That we know increasingly that learning is beginning in utero. We know that the period from prenatal to 3 is this incredibly consequential window of human development, where the fundamental architecture of the brain is wired in ways that will support long-term success. And we know that the optimization of that process happens as a result of nurturing one-on-one interactions, with children beginning in infancy. And so the book sort of lays out the question for parents: how are you going to ensure those interactions happen for your child? Um, one approach is that you are, and to be clear, under any circumstances, those need to be happening in the home. But as sort of a broader model, there are parents who, exit the workforce and actually, spend that time with their young children, developing that in the home. And then there are also parents that, choose early childhood programs outside of the home, what we call, but I'm trying to get away from calling childcare, other preschool programs. And so the book sort of makes the case, young children need these kinds of interactions. And so, plan ahead. And then as you are looking, for example, at enrolling your child in one of these programs, that one of the most important things you can be looking for in selecting a program is the quality of these interactions. And so, if I had one piece of advice for parents, it would be, as you're selecting a program for your child, go and spend time in that school. And I think everyone does to an extent, but what I'm talking about is not kind of a 30 seconds you peek through the window and maybe crack the door open and say hello and leave. Take an hour and set up a visit and just make yourself as inconspicuous as you can and just sort of get a sense of what's happening in these classrooms. And the thing to be looking for, in my mind, is what are the adults in the classroom doing? If you go in a classroom and you see that, that there are two adults in a toddler classroom and they are standing in the corner talking to one another, that's a big red flag.
Yeah.
Right? If on the other hand, they are down on the floor speaking at eye level, one-on-one with children and, engaging them in conversation about their play, extending their own language, offering sort of gentle suggestions on, how they might extend their play. That's a great sign of, if I had to pick one indicator of classroom quality, it would be watch the adults. And maybe the corollary to that is be very thoughtful about not being too dazzled by a pretty building, right? I've been in some really amazing state-of-the-art, beautiful, I'm sure multi-million-dollar buildings that look lovely. But if your choice is between a beautiful state-of-the-art facility where the adults in the classrooms aren't doing those things, and maybe a little bit shabbier facility where you've got wonderful adults, go with the adults every time, and you'll never lose.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Well, maybe the title of your book might seem a little bit pessimistic, but are you optimistic about the possibility to change what you see is going wrong at the moment?
I am optimistic, and I'm really hoping that the book helps to fuel that conversation. And you're right, and I can tell you that I chose what I thought would be a little bit of a provocative title deliberately. One of the things that that people have noticed about my social media, I think you sort of said it in the opening, is that it is sort of unrelentingly positive and uplifting, and is always showing if for viewers who maybe haven't experienced my social media channels, you'll find that it is exclusively uplifting, wonderful examples of what parents and children are doing. There's never you'll never find a video on my channels that say, let me talk to you about everything I see this parent doing wrong. And so it may be a little bit of a cognitive dissonance for people to see. The book has a little bit of a provocative title in the other direction, and I think that is a part of the message that I feel like needs to be communicated at this point. As and I see the two, and my work generally in policy is sort of going hand in hand, right? That if we know that all of these wonderful lessons that are illustrated in the social media space about just how much important development and learning is happening during these years, then how can we justify the tragedy really of what is happening in our public policy? I don't know if you or your viewers are familiar in the comic book world of Superman. there is a place that they call the bizarro world. And the bizarro world is this place where everything is the opposite of the way it is on Earth, right? That instead of a sphere, the bizarro world is a cube. And there's a version of Superman on the bizarro world, but instead of being a hero, he is a villain. And day is night and up is down. And the case that I am making respectfully but strongly in this book is that we have, in the United States at least, created sort of a bizarro world for children where they are experiencing very much the opposite of what they should be and what they need to be. And I can't think of a much better example than our approach to maternity leave or paid family leave, right? We know, for example, from child development that the earliest weeks and months of life are an incredibly important time for bonding and for attachment between infants and their primary caregivers, and that the establishment of healthy attachment during infancy undergirds all of our long-term mental health, for example. So we know that these early weeks and months are absolutely critical. And yet you may be horrified, as I am to say it, to find out that 1 in 4 American mothers actually has to return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth.
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Whoa.
Because we lack, a kind of a unified and common approach to paid family leave in this country. Now, to be clear, that's not every family. There are certainly families that are employed by employers that offer much more generous benefits than that. But particularly for low-income workers who may be working in hourly jobs, it is not uncommon that they have to return within 2 weeks, and that interrupts that that period of attachment. The same thing is true then in our early childhood settings, because teachers in these settings are paid at or near the legal minimum in their states. In fact, according to some recent data, we are paying our early childhood teachers 60 cents an hour less than we pay dog walkers in this country, if you can believe it.
Mhm.
What that leads to is an incredible amount of turnover in the field, that upward of 40% of teachers in childcare settings leave the profession every year. And so, whether it is, as a result of parents having to return to work prematurely, or, the interruption of these nurturing relationships in out-of-home settings, the end result here is that, healthy attachment is sacrificed to the idea of parents participating in the workforce. And there's absolutely a case to be made that that families should be able to support themselves and to earn a living, but ultimately the case that I would make is that we're paying in the long run much more for the results of that decision during infancy than it would cost for us to have a more robust paid family leave program. The book ultimately makes the case, because you've asked about parents and early childhood professionals. The one piece of advice that maybe I would want to leave with our policymakers out of this conversation, because they're always asking me, even policymakers who are pretty well convicted at this point that they understand this is important. The question is always, well, then how do we pay for it? Right. And the case that I make in this book is we are already paying for it. We're paying for the system we need already. The problem is we're paying for it in the dumbest possible ways, right? We're paying for it in poor health outcomes 30 years later. We're paying for it in terms of increased reliance on social services and all of those things that we talked about earlier in the conversation. So how might taxpayers benefit, and how might frankly, even the size of our government be shrunk by, making smart, proactive investments in the first place, as opposed to having to endlessly pay for the results of our inaction.
This is a wonderful message also for our policymakers.
Absolutely. But then time flies when you're having fun and having interesting conversations like these. I really hope that your book will help us in the US, but also in the Netherlands, to make these important changes. I want to thank you very much for being our guest here. I think we can recommend all our listeners and viewers to watch your social media posts, because they always leave a smile on your face every day. So keep on the good work with that also. And good luck, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Dan.